In this tip, I'll show you a shortcut key that will allow you to access the formatting pane very quickly. So this is a typical column graph that we have, and one of the things you pretty much always need to do in a column graph is to make the columns wider. So I can certainly click on the column series in my graph, but how do I get to that pane that allows me to the formatting that displays on the right-hand side of the screen? Well, I could right-click and then format data series down at the bottom. So that's one option. Another option some people do is to double click. Sometimes though your mouse moves between the one and the second click, so that doesn't always work. So the quick way to do it, because it works for all the elements in a chart, is shortcut key Control 1. So you hold the Control key down on your keyboard and press the number 1. It opens up the format pane on the right hand side. So now I can simply change, let's say, the gap width. I'm going to make it 60%. Instantly done. When I'm finished formatting, I simply close it. Now let's say I want to format one of the axes. I can click on it. Again, Control 1 opens up the format axis. Maybe instead of every 50, maybe I want to change the major units to 150. Again, very quick and easy way to get to that format pane by simply clicking on the item you want to format and then Control 1. In this tip, I'll show you how to select any data series or point within a data series even if you can't click on it with your mouse. We have a line graph here, and the two lines, the first group and second group lines, the blue and the orange, are very close to each other. And trying to click on any particular data point to select a line might be very difficult. Sometimes you'll have columns where one is covering up another column or a bar. So how do we do this? Well, when we select the graph, on the chart format ribbon, there's a drop-down list on the left-hand side, and when you drop this down, this allows you to select any series displayed on the chart. So if I wanted to select, let's say, second group, I would simply click on that series. Now it has selected every data point in that series without me having to click on it or try to click on it in that chart. But what if you want just one of the data points along that line or within a series of columns or bars? Well, once you've selected the entire data series, then use Control right arrow. So Control right arrow allows you to move through each of the points in that data series. So use the drop-down list to select the data series and then Control right arrow to be able to move through selecting each data point individually within that series. I want to show you how to be able to filter a chart. So select one or more of the data series and one or more of the categories without having to recreate new charts all the time. So we have a chart here that has 4 quarters for 4 years and 3 products. It looks very complicated, but let's say we just wanted to show one of the products. Let's say just product B. I could go and I could create a whole new chart if I wanted to, but the easy way to do it is once you select your chart, use this skittle here called the filter skittle. So when you click on it, it allows you to then select what is shown on the chart. And so I can unselect, let's say, product A and product C. Now it hasn't updated because it doesn't update until you click the apply button down at the bottom of that dialog box. So now we've shown a graph of just product B. And the nice thing here is that we didn't have to create a new graph. We didn't lose our original graph either. So if we wanted to, let's say, copy this for a presentation just for product B, then we can go back in and put the other 2 products back in. In maybe a different view, we show that. So similar to data series, you can also select categories. Now you notice there's always a select all, which is by default always clicked on. So if I wanted to show, let's say, just the last 4 quarters, I could uncheck the select all, which selects none of them, and then just go and select the last 4 quarters, click apply. And you'll notice it now has reformatted the graph to show only those 4 categories. So obviously it spreads them out much more because the size of the graph is the same, but we didn't lose our original graph. We didn't have to create another graph. So if you wanted to show all of them again, instead of clicking each one of them, now I did that with the data series because there were only a few of them. Again, just click the select all and it will check all of them, click apply, and you get back to your original graph. You can always just click the filter skittle to turn it off. So it gives you a really nice way to be able to select either series or categories in a chart. Maybe then you copy it out to a report without having to create new charts all the time and without losing the original chart that you've created. By default, all charts in Excel have grid lines. These are the horizontal lines that you see here, and they show up on a line chart, a column graph, a bar chart, all of the standard type of graphs that we use. But what if you feel that they're too prominent? How can we still include grid lines but not make them so prominent? What we do is we select the grid lines by clicking on them, and then in our chart format ribbon we use some options in the shape outline. Now, the two that most people think of right away are changing the color. So you could make it, let's say, a very light color. Now, that might be actually too light depending on whether you're printing it or projecting it in a presentation, for example. Another thing you can do is to change the weight. So right now it's 3/4 of a point. You could go down to something much thinner, maybe 1/4 of a point. But the one that I prefer, because it doesn't involve changing either of those two, is to actually use something in the dashes and set it to be a round dot line. So what the round dot line does is it doesn't change the default color, so you don't, if your colors are branded in your organization, you don't lose that. But by changing it to a dotted line, it really makes it not as prominent, but it is still there. And so if you need to change it back, you don't have to try to remember, oh, what color was it or what weight was it. You can simply go into the shape outline and change the dashes back to the solid line if you want. But consider using a round dot as the line for your grid line so that you still have them visible to the viewer, but they're not as prominent as the other information on the chart. In this case, the lines, but it could be columns or bars as well. When we have data that has a time component, such as this case quarters and years, or you might have months and years, the axis here can get very crowded because we're trying to include or have to include both the quarter and the year so that the viewer knows what that particular value represents. And what we want to do is to see, is there a way to make this cleaner? And there is, using a technique of a two-level category axis. I first learned this from Cole, Nussbaumer, and Affleck of Storytelling with Data. And the data here is set up the way it normally is. So what we're going to do is in our two-level, we set it up slightly differently. We separate our category labels into a first level or top level label here in column A, and then the second level in column B. And you'll notice the way that's set up, the first level only has one item, and it doesn't have another one until you switch the first level. So we only have 1 year, and then the 4 quarters, the next year, and the 4 quarters, and so on. So now when I select this data, and I insert my regular column chart, notice what Excel does is it knows that format of the category labels and says, okay, so there are two levels here. There's the year and there are the quarters. So now it separates the two and it makes it a much cleaner look. So if you have time-based information where it can be separated, whether it's quarters and years as we have here, or whether it's, let's say, months and years, take a look at using this method for separating your category labels into two levels. Make it easier for the viewer to see. It's often better to replace the legend in a chart with direct labeling, especially when it's a line graph. This line graph, we have our legend down at the bottom, but let's say we wanted to actually put labels on the end of each of these lines so that the viewer knows exactly what that line represents. Well, we can do that using a data label on just the last data point. So I'm going to select the line, and that selects all the data points. Now I'm going to select just the last point. And you'll notice that the selection circles only go around that last point, so we know we're just selecting that last point. Now I'm going to add a data label. And when I add the data label, I'm going to have to go to more options because the data label that I want is the series name. I don't want the value. That's not important. What I want is the series name. So I select that. I uncheck the value and uncheck show leader lines. The positioning in a line graph, typically we will want it to the right of that data point. And then we're done adding this. Now you'll notice what has happened here is that the label has run over the end of the line because it's long enough. And there's not really a lot of space here. We can make that bigger space. So if I select the chart and it automatically shows me the data, I can just use the handle down in the lower right corner, drag that down, and you'll notice what it does is it adds essentially a blank column for a category that doesn't exist here on the right, and now I have a lot of space for my label that denotes what this particular line represents. Another thing that I usually do is to set the text color of this label to be the same as the line color, so it's easy for the audience to connect those two, especially if they're going to be close, like down below. So once you've selected the data label on the home ribbon in Excel, you can change the font color just like you can for any other text. So I could select the gray, and if I wanted to, I could make it bold as well, make it stand out a little better. So then I can do the same thing for my orange line here. Add the data label with the series name, not the value. This is even longer, and you notice it has the space because we added that extra area here on the right hand side, and now I can just go and select the color and make it bold. Once you've added all of them, you can then use your skill to remove the legend, and you have a chart that is much easier for the audience to understand. They don't have to go back and forth looking at the legend to figure things out because you've added that data label of the series name to the last data point. Instead of using the legend on a chart, consider using colored text in the chart title. So we have a column graph here that has two sets of columns, the blue and the orange, product A and product B. Now the legend down at the bottom makes the viewer constantly go back and forth to figure out which color is which. But we can use the chart title instead, because the chart title allows formatting of individual text or individual characters. So I'm going to put in a chart title here, sales of product A and product B. And so I've typed it all in, but what you can do is you can select just some of the text. So I'm going to select product A, and you'll notice I get my text formatting pop up here. So I can change the color of this text to be the same as the color of those columns, which will be the blue. I'll make it bold, and I'll make it one font size larger so it stands out in that title. Similarly for product B, I select it, change it to be the orange color, bold, and that font size bigger. Now that I have the indicator of what the colors mean in the title, I can go ahead and remove the legend. And what I've done now is I've made it easier for the audience to understand which color of column is for which product by putting it right in the title. So consider removing the legend and replacing it with colored text in the title of your chart. In an Excel chart, you can type in the chart title or some of the axis titles, but Excel also allows you to make that a variable, draw it from a cell in the worksheet, and this makes it very helpful when you have to update a graph regularly. So if this chart needs to be updated every month, for example, one of the things we can do is we can have the key message here. It's early processing of material led to higher costs because the greatest variances are in those two areas that deal with and process the materials. So if we wanted to change that message each month, because the results change every month, instead of typing that in on our chart every single month, what we can do is we can set up a chart that draws from the data, so it automatically is going to change when the data updates, but it can also draw this particular title. So the way we do that is we click on the chart title, and whether it has automatically put a term in as it has variance here or whether it just says chart title, you can go to the formula bar, put in the equal sign, and then click on the cell that you want it to be using for that title. So when I hit enter, it puts that title in there, and so every time I change this particular cell, it will update that title. So next month I change this cell, the title of the chart automatically changes, the data automatically changes because it's updated. And so it's a very easy way to have your chart update automatically. We can also use this for the axis title. So I've put here a month over month dollar variance, because that's the specific label I want to use. Now I may not change that every month, but I can set that to be this cell as well. So in our chart, I'm going to add a horizontal axis title, and it says axis title. So again, I'm going to click in here, click in the formula bar, equals, and click on that cell. Now that particular axis title will be drawn from this cell. Now that one I may not update, and that's okay, but it allows me to have that option if I want to. So if you have charts that you need to update regularly, and the message of the chart is going to change each time, consider using the title being drawn from a cell as opposed to typing it in each time through this functionality that Excel gives you. Excel charts give you the ability to create and use custom data labels. So in our column chart here, we have the standard data labels up above each of the columns here. And because these are very large numbers, it gets very crowded and hard for the audience to understand such a large number. But what we can do is we can create a label that has the formatting that we want. So for example, because this is revenue, let's say we wanted to use this sort of a label here where we have a dollar sign, we have a number that's now been converted into millions and the capital M afterwards to indicate it's millions. We can create these labels and then assign them to our columns. So let's first look at how we create the labels. So we're going to look at 3 different ways to create the label. And the first one here is using a function called concat. Concat is the current function that you should be using if you're going to use this function. I'll show you the older function in just a moment. So what concat does is it allows us to put together various text strings. So you'll notice here the first is the dollar sign, and I've put it inside the double quotes, which is how we put text strings in side for the concat function. Then we have a comma, which says, okay, next item. Now we're going to use the text function. The text function allows us to format a number as text using the custom number formatting from Excel. So what I've done here is I've taken the value of revenue, divided it by 1,000,000, and then decided I want it to have 1 decimal place only. And then I add on the capital M, another comma, and then the capital M in quotes. So what this does is it creates this label, $105.4 M for million. So before the concat function was introduced, there was a previous function called concatenate. It works exactly the same way, it's just a longer word. And then another way that you can do this is to use the implicit join with which is the ampersand. So the ampersand character joins text strings together. So I use the same text strings, the dollar sign, the text function, and the M. It's just that in between each I use this ampersand. So some people prefer this because it's shorter and easier for some people to understand. But what they all do this exact same thing. It's just 3 different ways to get there. So what we do is once we've created the labels for all of our data points, we're going to go and we're going to format our data labels. And in modern versions of Excel, you have this option here called label contains value from cell. So you can actually assign the label to be a set of values from a set of cells that you designate. So I'm going to check that box and it says, okay, where's the range? So we select the range, and again, we're always selecting as many cells as there are data points. Click OK. Now we can uncheck the value and the leader lines, and the positioning is center, so that's where we want it to be. What we've done is we've now created and then assigned or used these custom data labels for our chart. And this gives you a lot of functionality and flexibility when you are deciding what should that label look like. You don't have to stick with just what Excel has as a default. You can create your own labels and then assign them as data labels to each of the points in the series. Data labels, like other numbers in Excel, can have custom number formatting. Here the data labels are using the default for our values here, and the default for percentages is to have 2 decimal places. So if I wanted only 1 decimal place, I can use custom number formatting, but we're going to go a next step and actually include indicators, these up and down pointing triangles, to indicate an increase or a decrease, and we're going to assign them using custom number formatting. So these triangles are created using Unicode characters. You see there the up triangle is 9650, the down is 9660. Now, custom number formatting can only use text strings. So what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to copy this cell, D2, so I'm going to copy it, and then I'm going to paste it right beside, but I'm going to say paste values, because that puts it in as a text string. Custom number formatting can only use a text string. So what I'm going to do before I create my custom number formatting is I'm going to highlight the characters in the formula bar and say Control-C, copy. It's important that you highlight the characters to copy. Selecting the cell won't be good enough. So now I'll go and format my data labels here, and in the label options I'll go down to the number format, and it uses the general category by default. I'm going to go down to custom. I'm going to set up a custom number format here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set it up. I don't have it yet, so I'm going to go and add it here. What I'm going to do is, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to delete what's there, and I'm going to Control-V paste. So now you see I have the up and down pointing triangles. So the first part of format code is for positive numbers. So I'm going to have the up triangle, and then I'm going to have 0.0%, and then a semicolon separates. So now negatives will have the down arrow, 0.0%, and then you can, the next is for 0. So if the value is 0, we can just put 0.0%, so it only has 1 decimal place. So we can add this to the list, and now you'll notice once it's added, you see how the data labels have now changed. And so instead of nothing for positive and negative in front of the negative percentages, we're using these indicators. And the nice thing about using a custom number format this way is that when the values change, whether they are positive or negative, the number format automatically applies, and so the correct triangle is applied whenever the number changes. This is a great way to use custom number formatting with these indicators that you can create to show positive or negative changes in an Excel chart. The ability in Excel to add custom data labels allows us to add a label such as this indicating the percentage change between this year in orange and last year in blue. And we do this by creating a custom data label and then placing it on an invisible line. So let's start with the label. The label here is a label that we're creating using, again, a couple of Unicode characters. The line that goes up and then to the right is 9484, and the line at the end that goes out and then down is 9488. And so what we're doing is similar to one of the previous tips, where we are creating a text string using these Unicode characters, the and symbol to join text, space, and then the text function. And what we've done is we've had this sort of helper column here, G, where we calculate the percentage change from last year to this year. So if it's positive or it's negative. And so we use the number formatting again to either put a plus percentage or a minus percentage so that it's very clear whether it goes up or down. So we've created this label, and to place it above the columns, we add an extra data series, which is a line. I've called it change line here, and here's how it's calculated. For each of the regions, it says what is the maximum value of that region, and then multiplies by 1.15. So I want it to be 15% higher than the maximum value. Why? Because I want it to be high enough up above that it's not touching the columns. And so the line is going to have these data labels applied to it. So let's show you how we actually create this graph. So I'm going to create the graph by selecting the 3 data series but not the customized label. I'll insert a column graph, regular column graph. We see the start of what we've got here, but the gray columns are supposed to be aligned. So I'm going to right click on the gray columns and say change series chart type. Allows me in this combination chart to say region C. Now I look at this and I go region ABC. That's not what I'm supposed to have. So one of the things to point out here is whenever you select a chart in Excel and create it, always make sure that the rows and columns are correct. In this case, it did not get them correct. So here's this wonderful button on the chart design ribbon called Switch Row Column. So when I click on that, now I get the regions down at the bottom, and the gray is my change line. So always go ahead and check that before you start the formatting. And that was something you saw that I went ahead, started the formatting, and then I could tell. Could I have told earlier? Could I have figured it out earlier? Yes, but when you get to the formatting is when you're typically going to find it. So change line, I'm going to change this. Again, I right-clicked on the gray column, said change series chart type. In the change line, I'm going to change it to a line. You notice the preview there shows us it's going to be a line. And what I can now do is add these data labels to it. So I'm going to select my line and use my skittle to add data labels. And I'm going to go to the More options. Here we're going to use this functionality that was added in modern versions of Excel, value from cells. So I'll check that and I say use the values in these cells here. Click OK and uncheck the value in the leader lines, and I'm going to put it in the above position. I could put it in the center position as well. Sometimes I find the center position is a little too close to the columns, but you can make that decision. I'll leave it there in the center position. Now the only other thing we have to do is select our line again, and then our chart format ribbon, set the outline to be no outline, meaning the line is invisible. And so now what we've done is we've created a chart that has these indicators of change up above the pairs of columns. So the audience, it's very easy for them to see, well, how much did it go up or how much did it go down? Those change percentages are there. And the addition of those special characters on the start and the end of that custom data label really indicates where the change is coming from. So that's how we can use that functionality within Excel to create custom data labels as well as position them on an invisible line, and it allows us to create that change value above each pair of columns. Using a custom data label on an invisible line, we can add an explanation anywhere within this column graph. So when I'm looking at this column graph, we can see in Q316 it continued into Q416. Product B had this great jump in sales. Why did that happen? Well, the explanation is that there was a viral video released for product B in Q316. How do I add that explanation? Well, one way to do it is to just simply add a text box, but I wanted to show you how we can do this within the chart so that we can change where the explanation is and change the text when we update the chart next time, next month, next quarter, and it automatically changes. We don't forget to update that text box. So what I've done here is I have the graph, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to add this next data series, and it only has a value above the column that I want to put the explanation. So I'm only using 1 point on the line. So I'll just simply drag the box to include, and I now see this gray column. I'm going to right click on the gray column, say change series chart type, and change that explanation line to a line. Now you notice you don't see anything in the preview, and I click OK, you still don't see anything because a line with a single point is not shown, which is really valuable for what we're trying to do here. But how do I select it? Well, remember one of the tips in a previous video. Go to the chart format ribbon, go to the drop down list here, and select that line. Now I've selected it. I can use my skittle to add data labels, go to more options, and in the formatting pane I can say value from cells. Now important here is you select cells for all of the data points in the chart even though you're only using one of them, because Excel expects it for all of them. Click OK. Uncheck the value and leader lines. The positioning here probably want to be center, so it puts it center over there. You could also use above. It puts it a little higher than I'd like, so put the center here. Now, how did I know what value to use for this particular spot that I wanted to place it? Well, if we look at the value that I've created here, I said what's the maximum of product A and product B, and then multiplied by that 1.2. So I'm just using 20% higher than the maximum value. If indeed you need it to be higher up or lower, it's very easy to simply change this value and the text moves. So if I think, oh, that's a little too close to these columns, what I can do is instead of 1.2, I can change this to 1.3. And everything moves up. And notice, because this is part of the graph, the axis automatically adjusted to take into account a higher value in this particular Q316. So the nice thing is that the graph will adjust based on the values that you're using. So this is a great way to add an explanation into a column graph. So you answer the viewer's question before they ask it, and we're using a custom label on an invisible line. If you have values in your chart that you don't want to appear, Excel has a great function that will allow you to make them disappear, or they won't show up. So this is what happens, the default set of values here for, so this is old version of a product, new version of product, and it's transitioning across this 9-month period. So we see how the old version had sales, and they dropped as the new version captured those sales. But you'll notice that the new version and the old version have 0 in some of the months, and when we add the data labels, it shows the 0. What if we don't want to show that 0? How do we do that? Well, we set up a data table that looks like this. So let's look at how we're going to deal with this. We're going to use a function in Excel that creates an error value. And let me explain. So the formula here is very simple. If the old version value is greater than 0, then use the old version. If not, then use this function called NA. NA is a function that creates a not available error value, and that's what this value is here, the hashtag n/a. Now, why would we want an error value in an Excel chart? Well, the reason that it's useful is because when we use that error value, it does not get plotted on an Excel chart. So I've created this chart here using those cells. So you'll notice that it looks the same in terms of the bars, but when I go to add data labels, I'll add data labels here on the outside. You'll notice that, and I'll do the same thing for the orange here just so you can see that. You'll notice that there are no values where it's 0, because what NA does is that if a data point has an NA value, it will not be shown on an Excel chart. So this is one of the ways that you can use that, but there are a lot of other ways you might consider using the NA value when you do not want a data point to show up. One of the examples I use it in regularly is where I want to split positive values and negative values into 2 different data series because of formatting. Where a value has positive, I don't want anything in that negative data series, so I will use a formula that will create that NA. NA is a really great tip to know about in creating Excel charts because it allows you to exclude those values that you don't want showing up in the chart. If you have data that will be regularly updated and you need to denote for the viewer the minimum or maximum value, you can do that automatically using a custom data label that is calculated. So what I've got is I've got the sales for each day in this time period, and then I have a formula here to create the data label. So what happens is it checks first if the value is the minimum value within that data series, and if it is, it creates a label. And here we're using the concat function, and we put together some text strings, value, and a date that we format with the text function. If it is not the minimum, then it checks if it is the maximum. If it's the maximum, then again it creates this label, maximum of, and it creates again a similar type of a label. And if it's neither the minimum or maximum, then it just puts in a null value. So we have all of the values here, most of them null. We have a maximum here on the 6th of January and a minimum of 20 on the 13th of January. Now what we can do is we can add these as data labels to our line. So I'm going to select our line and I'm going to say add data labels. I'm going to go to more options and use the function in Excel to add data labels from cells. So I'm going to select that. It says where are the labels? And I'm going to select this row. Again, we have to select all of the data points, even though there are only 2 of them being used right now. We'll click OK and uncheck the value in the leader lines. Now, positioning of these, what we want is we want the maximum one to be above and the minimum one to be below. Now, that's not possible automatically. So if we put them, for example, center, it's on the line, we don't want that. So sometimes choosing either above or below will make more sense. So this formula will change the where the positioning of the label is based on when the data changes. So for example, if we have another set of data and let's say on the 11th of January the value was 19, you'll notice that it automatically moves the label there because it's using a formula, and that moved the label on the chart. So it's a great way to be able to denote a minimum and or a maximum automatically on a chart, especially those that you update regularly, because the updating of the labels is done automatically. By using a combination graph in Excel, you can add a 6-month moving average line just to the last column, because it only applies, of course, to that last column if it's a rolling moving average. So how do we do that? Well, let's take a look at how we set up our data table. We have our normal utilization numbers. Those are the columns that we expect. And then we have a 6-month moving average. A couple things that I wanted to point out here. First of all, the series name. You'll notice it has 6-month moving average and then a colon. There's a reason for that I'll show you when we combine it with the value. Now the value is just simply taking the average of the 6 months, very standard, and then we've added another row here with that same number. The reason being is that this dashed line, we want it to extend to the right of the columns. So how do we take our regular column graph and add this on? Well, I've got the regular column graph here, and what we do is we're going to extend the what is being graphed by that extra row and now include, but it starts out as columns, which is expected because it's a column graph. So I'm going to right click on the orange column, say change series chart type, and change that 6-month average to a line. And now you'll notice that the line is there. And by default, it's probably going to be a line that has the solid line and in whatever the next data series would be. So in this case, it's probably going to be orange, but it's picking up knowing that I've used this before. So when you're creating this line, one of the things I find best is to make it a dark line. So I've used black here. And then the other thing I've done here is under the dashes, I've made it dot, the round dot, because I think that works well in terms of giving an indication. Now, how do we get this label up here? Well, I'm going to add a data label just to the last point on this line in the empty area on the right hand side. And use the skittle to add data labels, and I'm going to go to more options. And what Excel allows you to do is allows you to select a label that contains more than one item. So in this case, I want the series name, which is what gives us that 6-month average, the value, I don't need any leader lines, and here's the reason that we have the colon in the series name. Because the separator between the two values, the series name and the value, is by default a comma. When you drop this down, you only have a limited number of choices, and colon is not one of them. but space is. So we can use the space to put that space between the colon and the value. And positioning, we don't want it to be to the right because it runs over the line. Above is typically where we would want that to be positioned. So now what we've done is we've added a data label to show the 6-month moving average and positioned it. It is calculated by the formula we use. So when the data changes, that 6-month average automatically changes, and the label updates as well because we've used the value in the label. We haven't hard coded it, we haven't typed it in. So as that average changes, the label will update. So for example, if I just changed this from, let's say, 96% to 92%, you'll notice that the average is now 92.5%. It's gone down because that number went down. So you see how the line moved and the label updated. So that's how you can, in Excel, add a 6-month rolling average comparison to just the last column in a column graph. When you're showing data in a bar chart, you may need to add the change from a previous time period to the end of the bar. Instead of using text boxes, do it all as part of the chart. This is the chart we're going to create, and here's our data table. We have our different production lines, how many units they produced, and the month-over-month change in column F. What we need to do is we need to create a chart that is going to represent this. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to use an invisible space here, which I've called change spacer. And it's an invisible space that will hold our label, which says the down, up, or no change. So it's going to be a stacked bar chart, and it's going to have this invisible space. And the label we're going to use, we use a formula to figure it out. We want the correct word, up, down, or no change, and then we want the percentage, or in case of no change, we don't want a percentage. So what we're doing here is we're saying an if F2, the month-over-month change, is greater than 0, say up and then a space. If it's less than 0, down and a space. Otherwise, it has to be 0, so no change. And then we concatenate or add on to it, that's our ampersand, and we use our text function. So F2, how do we format it? So if it's a positive number, put it as 0.0%, so 1% with 1 decimal place. If it's a negative number, again, turn it positive. And then our last semicolon here with nothing after it says if it is 0, don't show any number at all. And the reason we need to do that is because otherwise the no change would show the 0% after it. So that's how we calculate this label, and then how do we position it in the correct spot. So I'm going to select my data here, again not selecting the label because we're going to add that with the function in Excel to do that, and insert regular stacked 2D bar chart. And I'm going to format it. So the first thing we need to do in the axis is to flip the categories so that they're in correct order, and let's make these a little wider as well. So now we have our production units, so we can add the data label there for all of them inside the end. Make that white because otherwise you can't see it, in bold. So what we have now is we need to add our values here in what is this orange segment. So I'm going to select the orange segment. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make it invisible. How do we do that? We set the shape fill to no fill. Now they're still selected, so I want to add data labels and go to more options. This allows me to select in the label options section, allows me to select value from cells. So then I can select those cells that I've correctly formatted. So I check that, it says where is it? So I highlight those 4 cells, click OK, remove the value and the leader lines. Now the position, you'll notice it's running into the blue bar. So the inside base position is best because it puts it from the left going to the right, so it won't run over the bar. And now that we've added our labels, we simply clean up by getting rid of the legend, the grid lines, and let's chart title. We can also remove the horizontal axis. Now you have a very clean chart in Excel that has not only the production numbers here, the values, but also the change values added on by using an invisible segment in a stacked bar chart. if you have values that also have a change from a previous period. In an Excel chart, you can add these colored triangles that indicate increase or decrease and the percentages on the end of the bars. And it's all driven by data, so that if the data changes, all of it updates. And here's our data table that we're using. We have our units, very simple here. And we have our month-over-month change numbers that came from our analysis. And what we're doing is we're setting up different data series to be able to enable to have these triangles as well as the percentages. Now the percentages are the easiest data series. It's just the change percentage, and it's the absolute value of the month-over-month change, because the indicator triangle will indicate whether it's positive or negative. So we just need the absolute value. And the way we get those triangles to use these two data series here, P and Q. Now why do I have P and Q? Because when those characters, lowercase p and lowercase q, are translated to a font called Wingdings 3, they turn into those triangles. And whether they should be displayed or not is going to be figured out with this formula. And again, we're going to use the knowledge that that NA error value will not be graphed, so that we can only include it when it's necessary. So P are the positive values, and our formula here is if the month-over-month change is greater than 0, then we're going to say the size of that space that we put the triangle in is going to be 10% of the maximum of the largest value. Now sometimes you have to play around with that formula depending on how big your numbers are. It happened to work here. So if that's the case, then put the number in there. If not, then put in that NA error value. And similarly for the Q, if the change is below 0, then we put the number in. If not, we have the NA. So you'll notice for each row there's only a value in either the P or the Q data series. So how do we format this the way? So let me just, this chart has already been started. We've got our stacked bar chart, and you'll notice we have the blue bars as we expect for the units, and then we have our different series stacked on the end. So you'll see it's either gray, which is the negative, or orange, which is the positive. So let's go ahead and format that to get the triangles in there. So I'm going to select this data series. First thing I'm going to do in my chart format ribbon is set the fill color to no fill, because we don't need it to be filled. Then I'm going to add data labels, and I'm going to go to my more options. And what we're going to do here is we're going to say that the label should be the series name, not the value. We don't need the leader lines either, and we can place it at the inside end position. That puts it closest to the percentage. Now it's still saying P. How do we get to change it to the triangle? Well, for any data label, if you go to the home ribbon, you have all of your fonts available to you. So what we can do is we can change the font to the font here, Wingdings 3. I've used it recently, that's why it's in the list up at the top. If not, you just scroll down to find it all the way down to the bottom. You notice it changes the triangle. And because this is a font, you can also change the font color. So I can change it to be this standard green. And now I have my upward triangles in green. Similarly, for my negative, I want the downward triangle in red. So I select the data series, chart format ribbon, set the fill color to no fill, add the data labels through the more options. On my label option, say I want the series name, not the value and leader lines, put it at the inside end. Now I can go to the home ribbon, change it to my Wingdings 3 font, and this time I'm going to select that dark red. So now I've got those indicators. The last thing I need to do is to put the change percentage. So it's this tiny, very, very thin yellow line. It's actually a segment in the bar chart. So I'm going to select it, and I'm going to set it to be no fill, so we don't see a fill color, but now I can add the data labels. So these are going to be the data labels, which are the percentages. So I can simply put them at the inside base position, and now I can remove the legend. And what I have here now is I have a chart that has my values, and it has the change percentages on the end using these indicator characters and color, so that the viewer can easily interpret, is this number of units either above or below the previous value that we're comparing it to. If you need to add explanations beside a bar chart, you can do that in Excel using an invisible space that's going to handle or contain the text. So this is the chart that we've got here, and our data table, we have our variance, which are the percentages above or below 0. And then we have, we want to line all of the text up in a column. So we have a spacer here called spacer 1. And what the formula says is it says round up the maximum of our variances. So round that up to 2 decimal places. So that's to the next whole percentage, because 2 decimal places is a percent. And then subtract from it. If the value of the variance is above 0, then subtract B2. And if it's not, subtract 0. So what that does is it's going to create a spacer, depending on whether it's positive or negative, that will line up the next segment so that all our text lines up left aligned. And then we have our text space. Now I've said 20% here, and then the rest simply refer to that. You are going to have to play around with that. Sometimes the text you have is not very long, sometimes it's longer, so you might need to increase that. And then I have the text. So this is using a stacked bar chart. So I've started it already here. And when we add our stacked bar chart, this is what it looks like. We have our segments. I've added the labels in there. But you'll notice we have our spacer segments and our text spacer. So I'm going to set the spacer first of all to be invisible. So I'll select that and say Format, Shape Fill, No Fill. And I don't need any labels there. That's simply to line all of these. You see the gray is all lined up at the left edge. So now this is where the explanations are going to go in. So I'm going to select that segment. I'm going to say again Shape Fill, No Fill. And here's where I'm going to add my data labels. And I'm going to go to more options because I'm going to use the function in modern Excel that allows me to add value from cells. So I'm going to select that checkbox, and I'm going to select all of the cells in this column for all the rows. Now you have to select all of them so that there are as many selected as there are rows. So I'll click OK. Say I don't need the value or the leader lines. And I'm going to put it at inside base, which is left aligned. Now you'll notice that some of the text here is too long to fit on one line is what it appears. It's actually not too long. By default, Excel will word wrap the labels, and it doesn't really give you an idea of why it's word wrapping at this particular width. But you can change that. So we selected our data labels. I'm going to go to the size and properties and go into the alignment. And I'm going to scroll down and I'm going to uncheck this wrap text in shape. Now all of the text is a single line, fits better beside the bars, and it's all lined up at the left edge. Last thing I need to do is simply get rid of the legend. And why this is important for you is because if something changes, as it always will when we have to update it next month, a new explanation, the segments move where they're supposed to and the labels will line up. So for example, let's say production labor next month, instead of minus 1.8, now it's 2.5%. And you'll notice as soon as I enter that, the spacer updates here because it's now positive. The number updates, and if I want to add an explanation here and say overtime required, type that in. As soon as I hit enter, that explanation shows up right beside that bar, left aligned with all the other explanations. So as you update your data and your explanations, your chart automatically updates. And that's how we can add a column of explanations beside a bar chart. If you have some values that are actual values and some that are estimated or projected values, then you can graph it so that the two lines look different and the audience immediately understands them. So here we have some data where 4 quarters are actual and the next 4 quarters are estimates or projections. So instead of having them all as one data series, I suggest just split them into 2 data series. So I'm going to move these values to a new data series, and we're going to call it estimate, estimated, and we'll call this one actual. And to make sure that the two lines meet, the first estimated value should be the exact same as the last actual value. So we'll just make that the same. So now when I create the line graph, highlight my data, insert the regular line chart, you'll notice that the two lines meet. That's because of that same value. And because they're two different data series, I can format them differently. So what I could do is, if I wanted to keep with the blue, I could make it dashed. So I can select this segment here in my format, go to shape outline, make it the same blue, but now go to the dashes, and maybe I'll use this square dot. And so now it's very clear that one segment is different than the other segment. And so this is what separates the actual and the estimated, by the look of those two lines. But to do that, you need to split it into the two data series so that you can format each one independently. If you have data for a line graph, but you have one data point that's missing, how do we make that line graph look continuous? In this case, we're looking at sales for each of these days. The 20th of January is a holiday, so we were closed. So there were no sales that day. And it's different than being 0, where we would have been open, but we didn't make any sales. We just didn't have any sales opportunity that day. When I create a line graph, if I want to show the trend of sales, select my data, insert my regular line graph here. You notice there's a gap. By default, when there's missing data, Excel does not graph it at all, but we can change that because there is a setting that controls what happens when there's missing data. So if I go to the Select Data button on the Chart Design ribbon, I get my Select Data dialog box here, and down at the bottom I'll click on Hidden and Empty Cells, and this is how you control what happens with empty cells. So there are three options. Gaps, which is the default, that's why there's a gap. 0, where it would drop all the way to 0 and then come back up, but that's not actually the case. Or connect data points with lines. So often when we're missing data and we want to see the overall trend, this is the option we should select. Connect data points with line. Now notice when you select it, it will not preview for in the graph. Even if you click OK, it doesn't. You have to click OK on the Select Data Source dialog box. And now we see it joins our 2 points with that line, so it's a continuous line and it's easier to see the trend. So if you're missing data, look at those different options on the Select Data dialog box to choose the one that's best for the data that you're showing. It's very common that you have to compare an actual value to last year's value and the budget value. So let me show you a way that we can do that using two dotted lines on a column chart. So the column is going to be the actual, last year is going to be to the left, and budget is going to be to the right. And so the way the data table is set up is that we have the item here, expenses, and the actual in the same row. Last year has its value, 56,500, in the row above and the same row. The budget has the same row and the row below. Because we're going to have the last year extend to the left, the budget extend to the right. Before we start creating our chart, we have to put a character in this particular cell here, in the first cell, the first column of the top row. The reason being is that otherwise Excel will misinterpret and think that the top two rows are actually the labels. So when we highlight, I can say insert my regular column chart, and we have the last year actual and budget, which is incorrect because Excel has guessed incorrectly as to which are the data series and which are the categories. So we're just going to switch our row column. Now we have it the way we set up, and now I can remove the A because we're done with that and we've tricked Excel. So now what we're going to do is we're going to right click on any of the columns and say change series chart type. So our last year, we're going to change that to be a line, and the budget, we're going to change that to be a line as well. And you'll notice we now have our lines and our column. So now when we go to format it, we're going to do a few things. First of all, the scale has not been set at 0. That's a problem because now it's misinterpreting or it's showing the data incorrectly. So I'm going to go ahead and select that, Control 1 to get to the format, set the minimum to be 0, and now that's set properly. The column width, we're going to set that to, let's say, 40%, make it nice and wide. And now each of our lines, we can set them up. So I'm going to select my first line, which is my last year line, and I'm going to format it. So I'm going to say, let's keep the blue, but I'm going to make it dotted. And I'm going to add a data label to the point that's on the left. So I'll add the data label through my Skittle here, go to more options, because I'm going to, in my label options, I'm going to say I want the series name and I want the value, and I want them, I don't need the leader line, I want them separated by a new line. So they're each on the line, and I'm going to put it above. Because it's a data label, I can change the text color to be the same as the line and make that bold. Similarly, for my gray here, I'm going to change that. Let's say I want to make that a darker line, so I'll choose maybe this darker gray here. I will also make it dotted and add the data label to the outside point on the right. So add my data label, and again, in my label options, I'm going to say the series name and the value, no leader lines, use the new line and place it above. And the final thing would be to add the value as a data label here to this center column. So just add that, let's say, in the center. So I can get rid of the grid lines and the legend now, and even the chart title. And what this type of visual does, it allows us to have a very compact visual, because I can make this a lot narrower. I also don't need that vertical axis. So now what I've done is I can make a very nice and narrow. So if you have a number of items that you want to compare actual to last year and budget, you could create a series of these graphs, or one graph that has a row in between. So we could create more graphs here if the values were, relatively the same. And you have a graph that you can easily see how does this year, our actual number, compare to last year and the budget by using two dotted lines on a column graph. In Excel, if we want to visually show how different segments add up to a total, we can do that using a stacked chart. I'm going to use a stacked bar chart here as the example. So let's say we have all of these expense items and they total up to a total. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to have each segment add up to that total. So what I've done is I've created a spacer, which is going to be invisible, and then we have our amount. So the way the spacer is calculated, it says, okay, take the previous spacer amount and add the amount onto it. So our first segment is going to be 476,000. Then we're going to have another segment that's blank before, and then 43,000. So it adds up to the total. And the reason I have the total as a separate data series is because then it's easier to format. So I'm going to select all of my data here. I'm going to say insert a stacked bar chart. You notice that the order of the bars is upside down, so I simply select that, Control 1 to format it, and I can scroll down to say categories in reverse order. Now it orders it the way it's supposed to. So you'll notice that let's also make these bars wider. So you'll notice that we have the blue, which is the spacer, and then the orange, which is the amount. So let me first take our spacer and set the fill color to no fill. And now you can start to see how these segments are adding up. Let's make that the blue color. And our total, we can make that, let's say, this green. Let's make them all a lighter color here so we can fit put labels in. So now I have each of the segments and I have the total. I'm going to simply get rid of the legend now because I don't need that, and I'm going to add data labels, and I'm going to put them at the inside base position, and then for the green I will put it at the inside end. So what I've done now, and rid of the chart title, I don't need the grid lines anymore, and I don't need the horizontal axis. So what we've done is we've created a very clean chart that shows how these segments add up to the total. And now visually, it's very easy to see which of these segments is larger than the others. And that is a good message that you can communicate using this visual that we've created just using a simple stacked bar chart in Excel. If you need to show a line with a range of possible values around it, you can do that in Excel with a combination of a line and a stacked area chart. So we have a situation here where we have months that we're predicting. Our baseline prediction is here. Then we have our low estimate and our high estimate. So the low estimate provides the lower of the shaded area that we want to show, and the high is the high of the shaded area. And it's going to be around this baseline. So the way we set up our graph is to have the baseline, and then we have a spacer. So the spacer is going to be an invisible area below the shaded area. So the values here are simply that low estimate number. The range is how big the shaded area is. So this is simply the difference between the high estimate and the low estimate, because that's how big the shaded area is. So when we create our graph, we'll select our data, insert our regular line graph, and now we'll go ahead and right click on one of the lines and change series chart type. So we want to change the spacer to a stacked area. Note it's the stacked area, not the regular area, but the stacked area, because this spacer is going to support the shaded area. And we'll change the range to that as well. And you'll already start to see in the preview how this is going to work. So what we're going to do here is we're going to take our spacer, select it, on our chart format ribbon, set the fill color to no fill, and now we have our baseline with our shaded area around it. So you can add labels if you want, you can change the formatting. If this shaded area is too dark, you can set the fill color to be a lighter version, and whatever other formatting you want. But now what you have is you have your baseline and you have your range of values around it, so the viewer can easily see what's sort of the high end of that range, what's the low end of the range, and is that acceptable for the decision that they need to make. So you can do that using the line graph along with a stacked area graph in Excel. I want to show you how we can create a column chart that appears to have conditional formatting, like the one we're seeing on the screen here, where certain values are in different colors based on the value or height of that column. We start in our worksheet by defining the different boundary values. So the boundary values here I've set are 3 boundaries, which means we're going to have 4 groupings. And the way I've defined them is that the boundary is less than or equal to. So if a value is exactly equal to a boundary, it's in the lower category. Now, you can define as many boundaries as you need for your particular situation. I'm just showing you 3 here. So our source data, we have production amounts for each of the months here through the year, and we have to turn that into our chart data. So the way we get the conditional formatting is we actually have 4 different data series, so 4 columns on the same chart, and the reason that it looks like it's only one set of columns is because they're overlapping. I'll show you that in a moment. But first thing we need to do is create the chart data. So we have our month, of course that's just simply copied in, and then we define our groups. So we have 4 groups. Group 1 is going to be less than or equal to boundary 1. That's what the B1 stands for. So when we take a look at the formulas in each of these columns, so the first formula says if the value for this month is less than or equal to boundary 1, which is B5 there, then put in the value. If not, we use this function called the NA function, and the NA function is used because in charting, if the value is NA, it will not be displayed. The column won't be displayed and a data label won't be displayed. So it's a very helpful type of value to use. So that's for group 1. For group 2, we have to use 2 conditions. So it has to be greater than boundary 1 and less than or equal to boundary 2. So our formula says if, and then we use the AND function, so we're specifying more than one condition. So B12 is greater than B5, and B12 is less than or equal to B6. Again, if that's the condition, we put in the value. If not, it's the NA. So we can see that for any one of the rows, only one of the columns has a value in it, and the other columns have NA. So January and February are in group 1, March is in group 2, and so on. I want to show you this one for August here. So this is a value where it happens to land exactly on the boundary, which is why it's very important to understand and to decide what happens when it's equal to one of the boundaries. So because this is less than or equal to boundary 3, and boundary 3 is 600, then it changes it. So you can set this up to be whatever the boundaries are you want, and because the formulas are always referring back to these cells, you can change the boundaries at any time in the future and the conditional formatting will update automatically. So when we create our graph here, our standard column graph, it starts out when you create the graph initially, you have the 4 columns beside each other. But I'll show you what we've done. We select any of the columns. I'm going to press Control 1 to show the format data series. What we've done here is series overlap 100%, which means all the columns overlap each other. Well, for each of the month, there's only going to be one of the columns shown. The others are going to be that NA value, so there won't be any columns there anyways. So we're not hiding anything. We're simply only showing the one that is for that particular value in that month. And what I've done is I've formatted the different colors based on the group. So group 1 I formatted as red. That might be well below an acceptable value. Group 2, yellow, it is below acceptable value, but it is maybe not such a big concern. Blue is maybe within an acceptable range, and green is above the goal value, making it be, superior performance in that particular month. So you can define that however you want. But as you change the values, those columns change the color. So for example, instead of that one that was exactly 600, if I simply change it to 601, you notice it changes from the blue to the green on the column because it is now greater than that boundary. And if you change some of the boundaries, so instead of, let's say 600, I make this 550, you'll notice that the 582 in July now also shows up in the green because the boundary changed. So it's a great way to set up your worksheet and create your conditional formatting column chart with flexibility, because you define the boundaries, the formulas automatically decide which group it fits into, and simply by setting the colors of the columns, adding data labels in those colors, you can automatically have your column chart update based on that conditional formatting when the data changes or when you decide to change those boundary limits. Often in Excel, you have to create a series of charts, not just one. So in this case, we have an example where we have market share in the West region. We have to do the same graph for the other regions. We'll just use the Southwest as an example. So what you may think you can do is just simply copy the chart. So I'll select the chart, copy it, go to my Southwest, and paste it. And I should be able to, all I need to do is update the title. Well, that's not actually the case, because where is the data coming from for this chart? Under our chart design ribbon, we can look at select data, and you'll notice here the chart data range is the West worksheet, not the Southwest worksheet. So in order to get it to use the data here in Southwest, we have to go and make a whole bunch of changes to a lot of the settings here. And for a simple column chart, it might not be too bad, but once you get into more complex charts, it can be very difficult to do that. So here's an alternative suggestion. Don't copy the chart. Instead, copy the worksheet. So I'm going to right click on the worksheet down at the bottom, say move or copy, and say move it to the end and create a copy. So now I can rename this, and it's going to be Southwest 2 because it has to be unique. Now what I'm going to do is I can simply copy the data from my Southwest worksheet, copy that, paste it into this new worksheet, and it automatically updates. Now all I have to do is to change that title. So whenever you want to copy a chart and use it for another region, another product, another time period, instead of copying the chart, copy the worksheet and then copy the data in on that new worksheet you've copied. That way the chart is always using the correct data. If you found this video helpful, there are 3 things you can do to help me out. First, click the like button below the video on YouTube. Second, leave a comment with any questions or feedback. And third, subscribe to my channel. Check out my websites and other videos with more tips and advice. Thanks again for watching.